COVID-19 has been the biggest disruption in education in history, affecting 1.6 billion children across the world. In Kazakhstan, 4.5 million children have been out of the classroom for over a year now. As the schools are gradually reopening, this may be the perfect time and opportunity to reimagine our education systems. To discuss ways of doing so, Mr. Andreas Schleicher, the Director for Skills and Education at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is joining me from Paris. Mr. Schleicher, welcome. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Mr. Schleicher, COVID-19 has been an unprecedented disruption in the learning process of students across countries. And while massive efforts were taken to respond to the short-term shocks to the education systems, the lasting impact that the experts are warning against is alarming. What do you see as some of the major effects of the crisis caused by the pandemic on education systems and consequentially on societies and economies?
Yeah, you know, our schools today are our economy and our society tomorrow. So that link is very, very clear. So the learning losses that we currently see will translate into lower labor productivity and ultimately, you know, lower economic success. And for students who had learned how to learn, who had good access to digital resources, who had, you know, parents with the time to support them, they may have found their way around closed school doors. But if you think about particularly disadvantaged students who, you know, do not have access to great alternatives, who may not have the teachers and the parents with the time to support them, and who have never learned to learn independently, I think for them this time has been really devastating and with very significant learning losses that we will see in terms of economic outcomes.
Mr. Schleicher, most school and university students have been able to continue their education throughout the pandemic through online learning. I wonder if the researchers at the OECD been able to look into the retention levels among the online learners, and are there any considerable losses or learning gaps that most parents report?
Yeah, you know, I think Kazakhstan has done really well in putting digital alternatives relatively quickly into place. But, you know, don't forget that learning is not just a transactional process. It's always a relational, it's a social process. Once again, you know, if you have learned to manage your learning independently, if you can, you know, plan, set your learning goals, monitor your learning process, then digital resources can be a great tool. But if you are not so independent in your learning, and particularly young children, if you think about students in primary school, digital resources do not actually provide much of an alternative. Now, you can use television a little bit, but actually students only learn a small fraction of what they would learn in a social environment.
Now, on one hand, Mr. Schleicher, the crisis caused by the pandemic has exacerbated the pre-existing inequalities and barriers to education, but on the other hand, it has stimulated innovation in the education systems. We are seeing advancements in connectivity, greater access to technology. Now, what do you see as the silver lining of the current crisis for the education sector?
Yes, and indeed, I think Kazakhstan is a good example here. You have seen enormous, not just technological innovation, but also social innovation. You know, teachers, schools taking much more responsibility for the design of innovative learning environments. Teachers, you know, growing beyond themselves, not just being instructors, but also being really good coaches, becoming good mentors, becoming good facilitators, good evaluators, and then technology, you know, being used not just to, you know, conserve existing pedagogical practice, but really transform it. You can see new pedagogies, new learning styles emerging. You can see a lot more kind of responsiveness at the front line. You know, how can we adapt our learning for our students? And I think these are very, very positive developments. And then, you know, combine that with artificial intelligence emerging in education. You know, technology can, you know, see how different students learn differently, you know, whether you get interested or bored, where you're good at, where you're not so good at, and then adapt learning so much more to the individual learning style. So if you combine that with learning analytics, teachers get a much better sense of how different students learn differently, and then can embrace that with more differentiated pedagogical practice. So I think, after this pandemic, education will be in a different place in terms of being able to leverage the potential of new technologies. But, the bottom line is always technology can amplify good teachers and good teaching, but it doesn't replace poor teaching. So in a way, I think the role of teachers has not become less important. It's become even more important in a technology-rich education system.
Mr. Schleicher, what are some of the OECD's key policy recommendations in regards to reinventing our national education systems for the post-pandemic world?
Yeah, I think the most important question we should ask ourselves much harder is, what should students learn for the post-pandemic world? The kind of things that are easy to teach and easy to test have also become easy to digitize, to automate. They're disappearing from our societies. I think that's a particular challenge for a country like Kazakhstan, where a lot of learning in school is about memorization, is about, the reproduction of subject matter content. But the modern world no longer rewards you just for what you know. Now, Google knows everything. The world rewards you for what you can do with what you know. And I think that's really, one of the most important questions we should ask ourselves. Now, our education systems are good at educating second-class robots, people who are repeating what we tell them. But today, we need to think much harder what makes us human. And this is about cognitive skills, but it's also about social and emotional skills, leadership, creativity, curiosity, courage. I think those kinds of qualities, that's for me the first question post the pandemic, asking ourselves, what are we educating for? What is the world that actually students need to engage with? How do we prepare learners for their future, not for our past? The second question, I think, after the pandemic is really, how can we reconfigure the spaces, the time, the technology, the people in new ways? Our education systems still have a very industrial outlook. We have someone in the ministry who thinks, what students should be learning. Then, we have teachers, broadcasting this, and students at the end of that assembly line. And the future of learning will look very differently. The future of learning will really look much more creatively at how we reconfigure time, people, space, technology to master superior learning outcomes. And the third lesson from the pandemic really is we need to embrace a much wider range of learner needs. The students learn very, very differently. And I think the kind of exasperation of inequalities is that education needs to take to heart. Even in a country like Kazakhstan, how do I get the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms? How do I align resources with needs? If you come from a wealthy background, you're going to have many chances in life. Even without a good school education, you will find your way through life. If you come from a disadvantaged family, you have only one single chance in your life, and that is a good teacher and a good school. So how do we, in education, ensure that the education arrives where it's most needed?
On this note, Mr. Schleicher, the Kazakh government is set to build 800 new schools in the next 3 years in accordance with the population growth forecast. How do we make sure that we're not only building infrastructure, but we're building an efficient education system that equips the students with the necessary skills for employability, for creativity, and for building a better future in our ever-evolving and ever-changing world?
Yeah, the infrastructure is always the prerequisite, but that's just, the starting point. In fact, the pandemic has shown us that learning is not a place. Learning is an activity, and we need to think how we develop, strengthen that activity, and that first and foremost depends on people, on teachers, on parents, on students, on the social environment. In a way, schools are often very good to keep students inside and the rest of the world outside. Now, I think in the future of the school, we'll need to be much more connected with the resources of communities. Now, the workplace and the learning places will need to have much better sort of connections. And I think that's a big challenge for the future, to make school more a kind of whole of society enterprise, not just, a public service. And I think that's where things start. And then, investing in teachers. The quality of education can never exceed the quality of teaching that you see in the classrooms. And it doesn't fall from the sky. This is about, hard work, really building those kinds of capacities. And again, it's not just done top down. It's done very much about, what opportunities do you create for teachers to learn from and with other teachers? What opportunities do you create for the profession to take ownership of professional practice? Now, that's where really change comes from. If you are an education leader these days, don't ask yourself how well people can follow your instructions. Ask yourself how well your people can collaborate and really, reinvent their tools and methods.
Does it also require a level of agility in the system so that not only the systems but also the people, the teachers respond to the changes in the market needs, in the market demand, of what types of skills they need to prepare within the students?
Yeah, and it's not just about responding. Actually, it's about, imagining the future. The labor market is very good in telling you what it needs today, but actually it's not so great in telling you what you'll need tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. So I think education really is about imagining the future and building the foundations. Now, that's, why we should probably teach less at the surface, formulas and equations, and go much deeper in giving people deeper conceptual understanding. Not just what you know in physics and chemistry, but can you think like a scientist? Can you design an experiment? Can you, distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? Can you think like a philosopher? Can you think like an historian? And I think those are the deep questions that we need to ask ourselves to prepare young people for their future, in which actually, today's labor market is not very good at imagining it. That's always the risk that we have in education. We see a lot of, computers around, so we think, we need to teach every student coding. But by the time the students today graduate, maybe the world is a completely different one. So education is not just about agility and adaptation. It's really about strategic foresight. We need to be able to anticipate different futures and prepare ourselves for them.
Mr. Schleicher, let's talk about Pisa, the program for international student assessment, which you oversee at the OECD. Since its launch more than 20 years ago, it has become the world's premier tool for benchmarking the quality, the efficiency of education systems across the world. In the last testing that has been done in Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan has scored pretty low compared to the OECD member states. What is the rationale behind scoring low? What do you think the reasons are?
Well, it really depends. There are some tasks where students in Kazakhstan actually do quite well. And typically those are tasks where they have to reproduce specific subject matter content. Now, that's what students actually do quite well. But when we ask them to extrapolate from what they know, to use and apply their knowledge in sometimes unfamiliar contexts, that's where Kazakh students actually have real difficulty. And that's more and more the task that the real world will demand from you. Look at this pandemic. We couldn't foresee it. We couldn't plan for it. But we had to, suddenly extrapolate, apply our knowledge in novel ways. And these are the kind of skills where Pisa places a great emphasis on because they become so important in our world. And I do believe that the education system in Kazakhstan needs to become better. Students need to get probably more room to experiment, to think for themselves, to work with others, to design, develop their own learning strategies. And of course, it's much harder to teach than just, specific facts and figures. But I think that kind of transformation will be very important, not for being better on Pisa, but for being better prepared for tomorrow's world, tomorrow's economy.
Now, in 2019, even before the pandemic, Kazakhstan's government has pledged that it will raise the overall national score in Pisa and will make sure that Kazakhstan is among the top 40 best performing countries by 2025. How achievable is this goal within this time frame? And what are your recommendations for achieving the goal?
Well, the time frame is obviously tight, but I do think, Kazakhstan does have the resources, it has the political will, it has the kind of governance mechanism to make that happen. Is it likely to happen? That's not for me to judge, but I do think actually the possibility is clearly there. I think Kazakhstan is in a good position to see more rapid improvement in its educational outcomes.
Sustaining uninterrupted and adequate financing in the education sector has been one of the major challenges that most countries were faced with during the pandemic. Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev made it a priority, increasing public spending on education and science. The public spending on the sector will gradually increase from the current 3.6% to 7% of the total GDP by 2025. Mr. Schleicher, what is the connection between financing and quality of education?
Yeah, it's actually not an easy question. Money is obviously necessary, but money is not actually sufficient. We do have some education systems that spend a lot and achieve still very little, and other education systems that actually spend their resources very, very wisely. And I think it's very important for Kazakhstan to invest more in education. Clearly, the past was not a very good kind of resource base for an excellent education system. But, money is just a start. I think the harder question is actually, how do you deploy that money effectively? You have to make choices. If you make your classes smaller, then you cannot also pay your teachers better and have more instruction time or better technology. And I think to get that combination right, I think will be critical for the success. And you can see very good examples, countries that have done that really well. You can look at, Singapore, you can look at Estonia or China, but you can also see bad examples, like the United States or, other big countries that have actually spent a lot of money and still don't do particularly well. So I think you need to reflect very carefully on how to deploy resources. And one thing is clear, the quality of education will never exceed the quality of teachers. The most advanced education system, whenever they have to, make a choice between a better teacher and a smaller class, they always focus on the quality of teaching. And that means, making teaching not just financially attractive, paying good salaries, but also making teaching intellectually more attractive, to build more interesting careers for teachers, to create more opportunities for teachers to collaborate, to become, designers of new learning environments and so on.
Mr. Schleicher, how would you sum up some of the biggest lessons learned during the pandemic in regards to how we approach education?
Well, I think we need to expect that the future will always surprise us. Today it was a pandemic, tomorrow it may be artificial intelligence or climate change, who knows? I think we need to be more open to alternative futures. We need to become more resilient in education. Students need to become more resilient, and that means, they need to own their learning processes. They need to be able to know, if my education doesn't work out as planned, I need to have a plan B. I need to actually manage my own learning goals. Teachers need to be sort of less looking upwards in the education and more looking outwards, to the next teacher, to the next school, to sort of see to what extent can I redesign, the spaces, the time, the people to achieve the learning environments I need today. Technology, in the past we used technology to conserve existing practice. Today we need to use technology to transform existing practices. And I think technology will play an ever more important role in education. So I see there are many lessons. The hardest lesson perhaps is that, disruptions can grossly amplify inequalities in our education systems. I think we need to redouble our efforts to close the achievement gap, to ensure that, we better align resources with real needs. Education is our foundations of the future. Now, our economies, our societies will depend more and more on what people know and can do with what they. So I think there's no question about this. In the past, you could rely always on the wisdom of others. Our economies, our societies only needed a few well-educated workers and a lot of people who work for them. Today, we need everybody to succeed. And I think that is a lesson that, is valid for individuals, but it's also valid for economies. If you look around the world, the most successful economies today have been successful because they invested in their people, in their human capabilities. Now, if you think about, Korea in the 1960s had the level of economic development of Afghanistan today, one of the least developed economies, and it started investing in its education. You could see the same, in countries like Vietnam and China. So I think actually we can learn a lot from this, to put education first, to build the foundations for long-term economic success.
Mr. Schleicher, thank you very much.
You are welcome. Thank you.